What if the Second World War never really ended the First? What if the peace signed in 1918 was never truly a peace at all, just a pause? A 20-year interval between one catastrophe and another. The same nations, the same borders, the same humiliations unresolved. And into that unhealed wound stepped a man with a clear plan and the patience to wait for his moment. Tonight we trace the entire story of the Second World War from the day the guns fell silent in 1918 to the day the bombs fell on Hiroshima. Look at this photograph. Paris, November the 11th, 1918. People are weeping in the streets. Strangers are holding each other. Hats are spinning through the cold morning air. A woman presses her face into her hands and her whole body shakes. You cannot tell if she is laughing or crying. Maybe she cannot tell either. The war is over. 4 years of industrial slaughter, of mud and gas and wire, of 10 million dead. And it is over. The bells are ringing across the city, across London, across New York, across every capital that had fed its young men into the machine and gotten silence back. But look closer at that photograph. Look at the edges. Look at the faces that are not laughing. The ones that are just standing there, still, hollow, staring at something no one else can see. Those faces know something the celebrations do not. Those faces have been standing in it for 4 years, and they are not sure yet what they have survived into. But before our journey begins, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight. Drop it in the comments below. Now let's begin. The armistice took effect at 11 in the morning on the 11th day of the 11th month. Somewhere on the Western Front, a soldier named Henry Gunther charged a German machine gun position at 10:59, 1 minute before the ceasefire. He was killed. He became the last confirmed combat death of the First World War. 1 minute. The war consumed him one final time, even as it was already ending. That is the kind of war it was. That is the kind of peace it left behind. 6 months later, in a palace built for the glory of French kings, the victorious powers gathered to decide what the world would look like now. The Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. Imagine the smell of it. Fresh paint and candle wax, and the sweat of 100 diplomats packed into gilded rooms, all of them certain they were building something that would last. Woodrow Wilson had crossed the Atlantic with his 14 points, his vision of a just peace, of national self-determination, of a League of Nations that would make war impossible. He believed it completely. You could see it in the way he walked into that hall. He left with something very different. The British wanted security. The French wanted revenge. Georges Clemenceau, the French premier, had watched his country bleed twice in 50 years at German hands. He was 78 years old and he had not come to Versailles to be forgiving. "This is not a peace," Marshal Ferdinand Foch said when he read the final terms. "It is an armistice for 20 years. He said that in 1919. He was right to the month. The Treaty of Versailles placed the entire blame for the war on Germany. Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. Germany and its allies accepted full moral and legal responsibility for all the loss and damage caused by the conflict. On paper, it was a legal mechanism to justify reparations. In practice, it was a humiliation burned into the national memory of a people who had not felt defeated on the battlefield. Their armies had still been in foreign territory when the armistice was signed. No Allied soldier had crossed into Germany. And now they were being told they had started it, that they had caused everything, that they owed the world for it. The reparations bill came to $32 billion, an almost incomprehensible sum. Germany lost 13% of its territory. It lost Alsace-Lorraine back to France. It lost the Polish corridor, a strip of land that cut Germany in two and gave Poland access to the sea. It lost its colonies. It was forbidden from uniting with Austria. Its army was capped at 100,000 men. Its navy was stripped. Its air force was dissolved entirely. A nation of 65 million people, one of the most industrially advanced on Earth, was told to kneel. And it knelt because it had no choice. But kneeling does not mean forgetting. The Weimar Republic inherited this wreckage. A fragile democracy born in defeat, trying to govern a country that blamed it for signing the peace. The men who had negotiated the armistice were called the November criminals. Stab in the back. That was the phrase that circulated through German beer halls and newspapers and political meetings. The army had not lost. The politicians had betrayed them. It was a lie. A convenient, poisonous lie. And desperate people believe convenient lies. By 1923, the German economy had collapsed so completely that the numbers stopped making sense. A loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. A single loaf. Women pushed wheelbarrows full of banknotes through the streets because a handbag was not big enough to carry what a cup of coffee cost. Workers were paid twice a day so they could spend their wages before the value evaporated. A man who had worked his entire life, who had saved carefully, who had done everything right, watched his life savings become worthless in the space of weeks. The cold of that winter settled into people differently when they had nothing left. It was not just physical cold. It was the cold of realizing that the rules you had lived by meant nothing at all. Into this atmosphere stepped a young Austrian with a gift for rage. Adolf Hitler had fought in the First World War as a corporal. He had been a decent soldier, decorated twice, and he had wept when Germany surrendered, not metaphorically. He actually wept. He was lying in a military hospital, temporarily blinded by a British gas attack when he heard the news. He pressed his face into his pillow and cried in the dark. Something hardened in him that day. Something that would not soften again. By 1923, he was leading a small but loud political movement in Munich. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis. On the 8th of November, he stood up in a beer hall, fired a pistol into the ceiling, and announced that the national revolution had begun. The beer hall putsch. He was going to march on Berlin. He was going to overthrow the Republic. He had 1,600 men and enormous certainty. The police had rifles. The putsch collapsed in the street. 16 of his followers were killed. Hitler was arrested, tried for treason, and sentenced to 5 years in prison. He served 9 months. But here is what those 9 months produced. In his cell at Landsberg prison, Hitler dictated a book. He called it Mein Kampf, My Struggle. It was part autobiography, part political manifesto, part fever dream. It was also, if anyone had read it carefully enough, a complete roadmap of everything he intended to do. The racial hierarchy, the living space in the East, the destruction of the Jews, the reversal of Versailles. It was all there, in print, available to anyone. Most people who read it dismissed it as the ranting of a failed street agitator. They were wrong to. Hitler, prison patient. That was perhaps the most dangerous thing about him. He had learned from the putsch. You could not seize power by force. You had to take it legally. You had to use the democracy against itself. He rebuilt the party. He gave speeches. He organized. He waited. Then, in October of 1929, the New York Stock Exchange collapsed. The Great Depression rolled across the Atlantic like a wave, and it hit Germany harder than almost anywhere else. 6 million Germans were unemployed by 1932. 6 million families who had survived the hyperinflation, who had clawed their way back to something like stability through the mid-1920s, watched it all dissolve again. Men stood in bread lines in their best suits because they had no other clothes. Children went to school hungry. The government had no answers. The moderate parties had no answers. The communists offered one answer. The Nazis offered another. And the Nazis were louder. Hitler's rallies were not political meetings. They were something closer to religious events. The torchlight, the synchronized movement, thousands of bodies, the music, the smell of smoke hanging over the crowds in the night air. He gave people something the Weimar Republic could not give them, a reason, a story in which Germany was not defeated and broken and guilty, but betrayed and great, and about to rise again. It did not matter that the story was false. It felt true, and when you are standing in a bread line in a good suit wondering how you will feed your children, feeling true is enough. The Nazi vote share went from 2.5% in 1928 to 37% in July 1932. In less than 4 years. That is not a political movement. That is a fire. The conservative establishment thought they could use him. Franz von Papen, the German chancellor, told colleagues that Hitler could be controlled, that they would hire him, box him in and manage him, that within 2 months they would have pushed him so far into a corner that he would squeak. These were not stupid men. They were experienced politicians who had spent their careers reading power. They read this one completely wrong. On January the 30th, 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler Chancellor of Germany. That night, columns of Nazi stormtroopers marched through the Brandenburg Gate by torchlight. Tens of thousands of arms rose in salute. The procession went on for hours. Hindenburg watched from a window. Hitler watched from another. The old man and the new one. The last of one world and the first of another. A journalist watching the parade that night described the sound of it as a single continuous roar, like something mechanical, like something that could not be stopped by ordinary means. The cold air smelled of pine tar from the torches. The light threw long shadows across the cobblestones, and somewhere in the crowd, people were singing. The interval was over. The second act was about to begin, and a continent that had promised itself never again was about to learn that promises mean nothing without the courage to keep them. Every tyrant needs a grievance. Hitler had a continent full of them. And the men who could have stopped him were too tired, too frightened, and too willing to believe that one more concession would finally be enough. The torches were still burning in the German imagination long after that January night in 1933. Something had cracked open in the national spirit. You could feel it in the way people walked, the way they spoke, the way a country that had spent 15 years with its head bowed suddenly lifted its chin. Germany had a purpose again. It had a story again. The fact that the story was built on rage and myth and the systematic humiliation of its own citizens, that part would take longer to see clearly. Hitler moved fast. faster than anyone expected. Within weeks of taking the chancellorship, he had engineered the burning of the Reichstag, the German parliament building, and blamed it on communists. The fire gave him the pretext he needed. Emergency decrees suspended civil liberties overnight. Political opponents were arrested, beaten, or made to disappear. By July 1933, every political party in Germany except the Nazi Party had been banned or dissolved. In less than 6 months, the most sophisticated democracy in continental Europe had been strangled in its sleep, and the world watched, and did very little. Then came the dismantling of Versailles. That treaty, the one that had humiliated Germany in 1919, had placed hard limits on what the German military could be. No air force, a tiny army, no tanks, no heavy artillery. Hitler looked at those restrictions and began peeling them away one by one, testing each time whether anyone would push back. In 1935, he announced the existence of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, openly and without apology. He reintroduced military conscription. Britain responded by signing a naval agreement with Germany that effectively legitimized German rearmament. France protested. The League of Nations condemned it. Nothing changed. Hitler had learned something important that day. He had learned that the word no from the democracies meant not yet. Maybe not even that. Then came the Rhineland. In March 1936, German troops marched into the demilitarized zone along the French border, a strip of German territory that the Versailles Treaty had kept clear of soldiers and weapons as a buffer for France. It was a colossal gamble. Hitler's own generals were sweating. They had orders to retreat if France resisted militarily. France had the largest army in Europe. All it had to do was move. It did not move. Britain counseled restraint. The League of Nations met and talked. German soldiers planted their boots on the Rhineland soil and stayed there. Hitler later admitted that the 48 hours after the Rhineland March were the most nerve-wracking of his life. If France had acted, his government might have collapsed. But France did not act. And so he learned the most dangerous lesson a man like him could ever learn, that the other side would always blink first. While Europe's diplomats shuffled papers, Spain was burning. In July 1936, a military uprising led by General Francisco Franco plunged Spain into civil war. It should have been a regional conflict. Instead, it became a laboratory. Hitler and Mussolini, the Italian dictator who had been playing at empire building in Africa, sent men and machines to support Franco's nationalist forces. The Soviet Union backed the Republican government, and the democracies, Britain and France and the United States, declared non-intervention and stood aside. The Condor Legion, the German Air Force unit deployed to Spain, arrived with new aircraft and a clear mandate to learn. At Guernica in April 1937, German and Italian planes reduced a Basque market town to rubble in a single afternoon. Hundreds of civilians died. Pablo Picasso painted the screaming aftermath onto a canvas the size of a wall. The world saw the painting. The world did not change its policy. The Spanish Civil War ended in Franco's victory in 1939. By then, German pilots had 3 years of combat experience. German tank commanders had worked out the tactics that would define the next 6 years of warfare. The proving ground had done its work, and the men who had watched it all from a safe diplomatic distance had learned nothing. Austria was next. The Anschluss, the union of Germany and Austria, happened in March 1938. Hitler wanted it for reasons that were personal as much as political. He had been born Austrian. He had spent years in Vienna as a failed art student, hungry and resentful, sleeping in shelters. Absorbing Austria into Germany was not just strategy. It was settling a score with a city that had once rejected him. Austrian Nazis had been agitating for union for years. Hitler pressured the Austrian Chancellor, Kurt Schnig, in a meeting that was less a negotiation than an extended threat. Schuschnigg tried to call a national referendum. Hitler told him to cancel it. German troops massed at the border. Schuschnigg cancelled the referendum, resigned, and wept. On March 12, 1938, German forces crossed into Austria. Crowds lined the streets of Vienna and threw flowers. Not everyone was cheering. Jewish Austrians watched from behind curtains, their hands trembling, knowing with cold certainty what the smiling soldiers meant for them. Britain and France protested diplomatically, then accepted it, then moved on, and then Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia was a democracy, a real one. It had a modern army, strong fortifications in the Sudetenland Mountains, and treaty obligations from both France and the Soviet Union. The Sudetenland was a region of Czechoslovakia with a large ethnic German population, and Hitler wanted it. He argued, with the same logic he always used, that Germans living outside Germany's borders were being oppressed and must be brought home. The Czechoslovak government, led by President Edvard Benes, looked at its alliances and believed it would not stand alone. It was wrong. In September 1938, the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Germany 3 times in 2 weeks to negotiate with Hitler. Think about that image. The leader of the most powerful empire on earth, traveling by airplane at age 69 for the first time in his life, to sit across from a man who had already demonstrated that his promises were worthless. Chamberlain was not a coward. He was a man who had lived through the last war and could not bear the thought of another one. He genuinely believed that Hitler's demands had a bottom, that there was a point at which enough would be enough. On September the 29th, 1938, Chamberlain, French Prime Minister Édouard Daladier, Hitler, and Mussolini met in Munich. The Czechoslovak government was not invited to the conference that decided its fate. Britain and France handed the Sudetenland to Germany. In exchange, Hitler signed a piece of paper declaring that Germany and Britain would never go to war with each other again. Chamberlain flew home to London. At Heston Aerodrome, he stepped off the plane, reached into his breast pocket, and held up that paper. He declared it peace for our time. The crowd cheered, genuinely cheered. People were so desperate to believe him that they let themselves. Winston Churchill, watching from the backbenches of Parliament, stood up and said that Britain had been offered a choice between war and dishonor. It had chosen dishonor. It would get war anyway. Nobody wanted to hear it. Not yet. Czechoslovakia lost its mountain fortifications with the Sudetenland. It lost its industrial base. It lost the one geographic feature that had made it defensible. In March 1939, German troops marched into Prague and swallowed what remained of the country whole. This time, there was no ethnic German population to claim as justification. This time, the mask was fully off. Hitler had lied about Munich. He had always been lying, and the men who had handed him Czechoslovakia stood in the rubble of their own policy and had to find new words for what had happened. Britain and France gave Poland a guarantee. If Germany invaded Poland, they would go to war. This was the line. This was where the concessions ended. Hitler did not believe them. On August the 23rd, 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact. The world stared at the news in disbelief. Two ideological enemies, fascism and communism, two systems that had been screaming at each other for years, shaking hands. What the public did not know was the secret protocol attached to that pact. It divided Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence. Poland was already carved up on paper before a single shot was fired. The air over Europe in those last days of August tasted of something sharp and chemical, like the moment before a storm when the pressure drops and the birds go quiet. In Warsaw, families packed bags and then unpacked them again, unable to decide whether to stay or run. In London, civil servants distributed gas masks. In Berlin, crowds gathered at newspaper stands and read the headlines with expressions that mixed excitement with something that was not quite fear, but was its neighbor. On September the 1st, 1939, at 4:45 in the morning, the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on a Polish military garrison at Westerplatte, near Danzig. It had been sent there on a goodwill visit weeks earlier. The crew had eaten breakfast on the deck in the sun. Now the guns were firing. Simultaneously, German armored divisions crossed the Polish border at multiple points. Stuka dive bombers screamed over Warsaw, their sirens wailing, a sound specifically designed to make the people below it feel that the world was ending. Britain and France delivered their ultimatums. Germany ignored them. On September the 3rd, both nations declared war. Chamberlain went on the BBC and told the British people in a voice that sounded like a man swallowing glass that everything he had worked for, everything he had hoped for, had crashed in ruins. The paper he had waved at the airport had lasted 11 months. Now the real reckoning began. And this time, there would be no front lines. There would be no safe distance. The war would come for everyone. They were preparing for the last war. Hitler was fighting the next one. And by the time Europe understood the difference, it was nearly too late. A Polish cavalry unit moves through the September morning mist somewhere near the German border. The horses are nervous. You can hear it in the way their hooves keep breaking rhythm, the way their breath comes in short, visible bursts in the cold air. The riders are not cowards. They are soldiers who are trained for this, who believe in what they are doing. But nothing in their training prepared them for what comes next. The sound arrives before the shape does. A low mechanical grinding, growing louder, shaking the ground beneath the horses' feet. Then the panzers emerge from the tree line. Not one, not two. A wall of steel moving at a speed that makes no sense, that the horses cannot process, that the riders cannot process either, because their minds are still living in 1914. The horses scatter. The riders try to hold formation, and the tanks roll on without slowing. That was Poland in the first week of September 1939. 1.5 million German soldiers crossed the border. The Luftwaffe did not wait for ground forces to find resistance. It destroyed the resistance first. Dive bombers screamed over railway lines, over communication towers, over airfields. The Stuka's siren wail was not accidental. It was engineered to cause panic, and it worked. The smell of burning fuel and shattered concrete drifted across Warsaw within hours of the first attack. By the time French and British generals in Paris and London finished their morning briefings, the Polish Air Force was already crippled on the ground. The Blitzkrieg was not simply speed. It was a new idea about how war could work. General Heinz Guderian had spent years arguing that tanks should not be spread thin across infantry lines, the way they had been in the last war. Concentrate them. Drive them deep into enemy territory. Let them punch holes that motorized infantry then floods through. Use the dive bombers, not as weapons of destruction alone, but as weapons of confusion, targeting supply lines and rear positions, making the enemy feel surrounded even before they are. The Polish army fought on a massive front, both along the German border in the west and against German territory in the north and south. They could not consolidate. They could not adapt fast enough. And on September the 17th, the knife went in from the other side. Soviet forces crossed Poland's eastern border. The country now fought a war on two fronts simultaneously, with no reserves left to draw on. Warsaw held for 10 more days. German bombers hit the city in waves, killing civilians by the thousands. The Polish garrison inside the capital fought in the rubble, in the smoke, in the silence between explosions that was somehow worse than the noise. On September the 28th, Poland surrendered. 14,000 Germans were dead or missing. 66,000 Poles were dead. 700,000 more were taken prisoner. The country that had existed since 1918 was gone, carved up between two dictators who had agreed on the borders over a secret protocol that most of the world did not yet know existed. Then something strange happened. Nothing. France and Britain had declared war on Germany on September the 3rd. But they did not attack. From October 1939 through March 1940, the Western Front sat almost entirely silent. Soldiers on both sides dug in. Newspapers called it the phony war. In French, it was the drôle de guerre, the funny war, the joke war. Except nobody was laughing in Warsaw. The French military had a plan. It was called the Maginot Line, a vast network of fortifications running along the French-German border. Concrete bunkers, underground tunnels, artillery positions built into the earth. Impressive, expensive, and fixed. The generals who built it were thinking about Verdun, about the grinding, static horror of the last war. They assumed the next one would look the same. They were wrong in a way that would cost millions of lives. Germany invaded Denmark and Norway on April the 9th, 1940. Denmark fell in hours. Norway resisted, but its government fled to the countryside within days. A Norwegian fascist named Vidkun Quisling announced himself as the new prime minister under German administration. Britain tried to defend Norway with ground troops and air support, but could not hold. By June the 10th, the campaign was over. Germany now controlled the North Atlantic coastline from Norway all the way down. Britain's naval blockades had been outmaneuvered. The iron supply routes from northern Sweden were open again. And then, on May the 10th, 1940, the real blow fell. Germany invaded France and the Low Countries. The Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg. 3 German army groups moved simultaneously. 2 of them swept through Belgium and the Netherlands in a movement that looked to Allied commanders like a repeat of the old Schlieffen Plan from the last war. Allied forces moved north to meet them. That was exactly what the Germans wanted, because the Third Army Group was doing something that no one expected. It was moving through the Ardennes. The Ardennes was dense forest, rough terrain. Military doctrine said tanks could not move effectively through it. The Maginot Line did not extend that far north because the planners assumed the forest was its own defense. They assumed wrong. Gerd von Rundstedt's forces pushed through the Ardennes and crossed the Meuse River on May the 13th. The French general Maurice Gamelin reported to his prime minister the next morning that the Germans might reach Paris within days. He was replaced immediately. His replacement, the retired General Maxime Weygand, was in Syria. He would not arrive for another week. France's high command was left without its top general for 7 days, while German armor drove west through open, undefended land. By May the 20th, German forces had reached the English Channel. They turned north. Allied armies in Belgium were now cut off from the main French force to the south. The Belgians were encircled in Flanders. On May the 27th, King Leopold III surrendered his army. The British Expeditionary Force and the French troops alongside them were compressed into a shrinking pocket around the port of Dunkirk. The sea was behind them. The Germans were closing in on 3 sides. On May the 24th, Hitler ordered his panzer divisions to stop, to hold their positions. The exact reason for this order has been debated ever since. What is known is that it gave the men on those beaches a window, not a large one, but a window. Operation Dynamo began on May the 26th. The British Navy did not have enough vessels, so they asked for everything else. Fishing boats, pleasure cruisers, ferries, lifeboats, river barges. The call went out across southern England, and the boats came. Their civilian owners sometimes still at the wheel, crossing the channel toward the black smoke rising over the French coastline. The water tasted of oil and salt. The beaches at Dunkirk were not shelter. They were exposure. Men stood in lines, stretching out into the surf, waiting for small boats to carry them to larger ones, while the Luftwaffe flew overhead and the sand erupted around them. Over 9 days, 338,000 men were pulled off those beaches. 198,000 British, 140,000 French. They came back without their tanks, without their artillery, without most of their equipment. They came back exhausted, salt-soaked, some of them shaking so hard they could not hold a cup. But they came back. The army that Britain would need for the rest of the war came back. France did not. On June the 5th, the Germans crossed the Somme. On the 9th, they crossed the Seine. On the 10th, Italy declared war on France and Britain. Mussolini had watched from Rome, waiting to see which way the weight would fall, and now he moved. On June the 14th, German soldiers walked into Paris. The city had been declared open, meaning undefended, to prevent its destruction. The streets were quiet. The cafes were closed. A few people watched from windows. Most had already left. The French government had fled south, first to Tours, then to Bordeaux. Prime Minister Reynaud resigned on June the 16th. His successor, the aged Marshal Philippe Pétain, asked the Germans for terms the following day. On June the 22nd, France signed an armistice. The location chosen by Hitler was deliberate and precise. He had the old railway carriage from Compiègne, the exact carriage in which Germany had surrendered to France in November 1918, brought back to the same clearing in the same forest. France signed its surrender in the same room where Germany had signed its humiliation 22 years before. Then Hitler had the carriage destroyed so it could never be used again. France was divided. The northern and western portions came under direct German military occupation. The southern portion became a nominally autonomous state based in the spa town of Vichy, governed by Pétain, collaborating with Berlin. From London, a French general named Charles de Gaulle broadcast an appeal to the French people on June the 18th. He told them the battle was not over, that France was not France's government, but France's people. Most of those people at that moment could not hear him. Churchill had become Prime Minister on May the 10th, the same day Germany invaded France and the Low Countries. Chamberlain had resigned, broken by the failure of Norway, broken by the weight of the years behind him. Churchill took the job with no illusions. In his first speech to the House of Commons, he had offered nothing but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. He meant it. On June the 4th, the day the last boats left Dunkirk, he stood before the Commons again. His voice on the recording is not the triumphant roar that later mythology would make of it. It is the voice of a man who has looked at the numbers and refuses to accept what they say. "We shall fight on the beaches," he told them. "We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall never surrender." That night, privately, he told a colleague that he feared the war was already lost. Think about what that means. The man who had just delivered the most defiant speech in the English language walked out of the chamber and admitted in private that he did not know if any of it would be enough. That is not weakness. That is honesty. That is what real courage looks like. Not the absence of fear, the decision to speak anyway. Britain now stood alone. No allies on the continent. No certainty of survival. The army that had returned from Dunkirk was intact but stripped of its weapons. The channel was 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, and somewhere across that narrow strip of water, the Luftwaffe was already being given its orders. The blip appears at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. She is sitting at her radar console somewhere along the Kent coast, watching the cathode screen the way you watch a sleeping child. Quiet, then less quiet. 1 return signal, then 3, then a dozen. Then the screen fills with them, blooming outward like a bruise spreading across pale skin. Her hand reaches for the telephone before her mind has fully caught up with what her eyes are seeing. 348 bombers, 617 fighters, nearly 1,000 aircraft in a single formation, climbing out of the French coast and turning northwest toward the Thames estuary. It is September the 7th, 1940, and Britain, which has survived the summer by the thinnest possible margin, is about to face something new. Something worse. The summer had already nearly killed them. Since July, the Luftwaffe had been hammering RAF airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories. The logic was cold and clear. Hitler's plan, Operation Sea Lion, required crossing the channel with barges full of soldiers. But the Royal Navy would tear those barges apart unless German aircraft controlled the sky above them. So the Luftwaffe's job was to destroy the RAF first, grind it down, sweep it from the sky. Then the invasion could begin. It almost worked. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding had designed the British air defence system with the precision of a man who knows he cannot afford to waste a single plane. He had fewer aircraft than the Germans, far fewer trained pilots, but he had 2 things the Luftwaffe did not expect. He had radar, a network of coastal stations that gave his controllers 20 minutes of warning before German planes crossed the coast, and he had Keith Park, the New Zealander commanding 11 Group in the southeast, who understood that the goal was not to win every fight. The goal was to survive long enough to make the cost unbearable. Through August, the fighting was savage. Pilots flew 3, 4, 5 sorties a day. They landed, refueled, took off again before the sweat had dried on their skin. They were young, most of them, some barely old enough to shave. and they came from everywhere. Polish pilots who had watched their country destroyed and wanted nothing more than to put a German aircraft in their gun sights. Czech pilots, Canadian pilots, a handful of Americans who had crossed the Atlantic because they could not sit still and watch. The RAF in the summer of 1940 was not simply British, it was every person who had decided that this particular line was the one they would not let be crossed. Churchill would later say that never in the field of human conflict had so much been owed by so many to so few. He said it in August, looking at the casualty figures. He was not being poetic. He was being precise. By early September, the RAF was breaking. Not the aircraft, the men. Experienced pilots were being lost faster than new ones could be trained. Airfields in the south were so badly damaged that some squadrons were operating from grass strips with bomb craters filled in overnight. The ground crews worked through the darkness, smelling of aviation fuel and exhaustion, patching fuselages with cold hands, knowing the planes had to be ready again by dawn. The system was holding, but only just. Then Hitler made his mistake. On the night of August the 24th, a German bomber crew, possibly lost, dropped their bombs on London. Churchill ordered a retaliatory raid on Berlin. The damage was minimal. The psychological effect on Hitler was not. He was furious. He ordered the Luftwaffe to abandon the airfields and bomb London instead. His generals knew this was a strategic error. Destroying the RAF's infrastructure was working. Switching to cities would let the airfields recover. But Hitler wanted London to burn. So at 4 o'clock on the afternoon of September the 7th, the radar operator's screen fills up and the largest air fleet ever assembled turns toward the capital. You could see it from 50 miles away. The East End docklands caught first. Warehouses full of timber, paint, rubber, and sugar, all of it roaring in the late afternoon heat. The sky above the Thames turned orange, then red, then a deep and terrible amber that you could navigate by from the air. Firemen who had trained for emergencies found themselves facing something their training had never imagined. Streets of flame, roads that ended in walls of fire, the heat-blistered paint off vehicles 2 blocks away. That night, 448 civilians died. More than 1,600 were seriously wounded. And then the bombers came back the next night, and the night after that. For 57 consecutive nights, London was bombed. Every single night. The Blitz had begun, and with it came a new kind of war. Not a war between armies, a war against the city itself. Against the people sleeping in their houses, queuing for bread, riding the bus to work. Against the fabric of ordinary life. The underground stations became shelters. People dragged blankets and pillows down the escalators and claimed their patches of platform. The smell was thick, a mixture of bodies and damp concrete, and the faint metallic tang of the rails. Children slept in rows on the tiles. Old men played cards. Women knitted. Above them, the city shook. Down here, for a few hours, it was almost possible to pretend the world was still in order. Not everyone went underground. Some families had Anderson shelters, corrugated iron half buried in their back gardens, cold and damp and smelling of earth. Some simply stayed in their beds because the alternative was to admit that the world had become a place where staying in your bed might kill you. Fire watchers climbed to rooftops with buckets of sand and stirrup pumps, scanning the darkness for incendiaries, trying to catch them before they caught hold. They stood up there in the cold and the noise and the shaking air and did their job. This is the thing that is hardest to explain about the Blitz, and the most important. The people did not break, not because they were not frightened. They were terrified, not because the destruction was not real. Entire streets vanished, hospitals were hit, churches collapsed. A city that had stood for 1,000 years was being unmade, night by night, block by block. And yet the buses ran the next morning. The shops opened, or tried to. People went to work through rubble-strewn streets with a kind of furious, almost irrational insistence on normality that was itself a form of defiance. Churchill understood this instinctively. He toured the bombed areas in person. He walked through the wreckage in his overcoat and his hat, with his cigar and his walking stick, and he stopped to talk to people picking through the ruins of their homes. There are photographs of him surrounded by people who should have been broken and are instead grinning, shouting, giving the V sign. Whether that was genuine or performed or some mixture of both does not matter. What matters is that Churchill went. He showed up. He stood in the same rubble they were standing in and let them see that the government had not retreated somewhere safe and left them to manage alone. His speeches on the radio reached into living rooms and underground shelters and factory canteens and said in plain language that what these people were doing mattered, that their endurance was not passive suffering. It was a weapon. Every night London survived was a night the invasion had not come. Across the Atlantic, a president watched and calculated. Franklin Roosevelt wanted to help Britain. His instincts and his judgment told him that a Nazi-controlled Europe was an existential threat to American interests. But America was not ready for war. The public was not ready. The Congress was not ready. So Roosevelt found other ways. Lend-Lease, the policy that allowed Britain to borrow American war materials without immediate payment, was still being negotiated, but the direction of American sympathy was shifting, partly because of the BBC broadcasts, partly because of American journalists in London filing dispatches from the middle of the bombing, partly because of Churchill's careful, relentless cultivation of the relationship. Churchill wrote Roosevelt letters that were works of art. He never begged. He laid out the strategic reality with clarity and then trusted Roosevelt to draw his own conclusions. The two men had not yet met, but they were already building something. Meanwhile, the RAF recovered. With the pressure on the airfields eased, Dowding's system rebuilt itself. The radar stations came back online. New pilots moved through training. The Spitfires and Hurricanes kept rising to meet the German formations, and the Luftwaffe's losses mounted in a way that Göring had not planned for and could not sustain. On September the 15th, a day later named Battle of Britain Day, the RAF shot down so many German aircraft that the Luftwaffe's commanders had to report the figures to Berlin with a kind of stunned disbelief. The Battle of Britain was over. The Germans had not achieved air superiority. Without air superiority, Sea Lion was impossible. In October, Hitler postponed the invasion indefinitely. Britain had survived, not comfortably, not cleanly. The Blitz would continue through the winter and into the spring, killing more than 40,000 British civilians before it was done. The cost was enormous in human grief, in homes and churches and hospitals and ordinary streets that would never be rebuilt the same way. The survival was real, but it was not clean. Somewhere in Germany, in the last weeks of 1940, an aide walks into a room and finds Hitler standing at a map. He describes the mounting losses over Britain. The RAF is unbroken. Sea Lion is postponed. The Channel has held. Hitler looks at the map for a long moment. Then his gaze moves, not west, not toward the Atlantic, east, across Poland, across the vast flat plains that stretch toward Moscow. His generals have already been quietly briefed. They have already raised their objections. The plan is enormous. It is brutal. It is, by any rational strategic assessment, reckless to the point of madness. He had failed to break Britain, but he was not finished. He had always had another plan, a plan so enormous, so brutal, so strategically reckless that his own generals thought he had lost his mind. He was about to invade the Soviet Union. Before dawn on June the 22nd, 1941, a young Soviet soldier stands at a border post in Belarus. He cannot sleep. There is something wrong with the air. A vibration, low and constant, moving through the ground beneath his boots. He presses his hand flat against the wooden wall of the guardhouse. The wood is trembling. Then the horizon turns white. At 3:15 in the morning, on the longest day of the year, Adolf Hitler launched the greatest military operation in human history. He called it Barbarossa. His generals called it the war that would end the war. History would call it the beginning of a catastrophe without precedent in the story of the human race. 3.8 million Axis soldiers crossed into Soviet territory that morning. 3.8 million, along a front nearly 3,000 kilometers wide, from the Baltic coast in the north to the Black Sea in the south. The ground shook with the weight of tanks and artillery. The smell of diesel and churned earth rolled ahead of the columns like a wave. Soviet border troops, many of them still half-dressed, stumbled out of barracks into a world that had already been rearranged around them. Stalin had been warned. British intelligence had told him. His own spies had told him. The date, the plan, the scale. He had dismissed every warning. He had signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler in 1939. He believed, with a certainty that would cost millions of lives, that Hitler would not break it. Not yet. When the reports began arriving in Moscow in the first hours of the invasion, Stalin sat in silence. His generals waited for orders. The orders did not come. For days, the man who had ruled the Soviet Union with absolute terror, who had sent millions to the gulags on a whisper, who had executed his own military commanders in purges just a few years earlier, that man sat paralyzed. He retreated to his dacha outside Moscow. He would not take calls. His generals stood in the corridor outside his door, whispering to each other, not sure if he was broken or simply waiting. The Germans advanced at a speed that stunned even themselves. Minsk fell in less than a week. The encirclement near Kiev trapped over 600,000 Soviet soldiers. Men surrendered in numbers that the Wehrmacht had no infrastructure to handle. They were marched in columns stretching to the horizon through dust and summer heat, without water, without food. Soviet POWs died in German captivity by the hundreds of thousands. Not in battle, in fields, in open-air holding pens, of thirst and starvation and deliberate neglect. The German generals were euphoric. The plan was working. The Soviet Union was enormous, yes, but it was crumbling. The blitzkrieg that had devoured Poland in weeks, France in 6 weeks, was now consuming a continent. By autumn, the Wehrmacht was within striking distance of Moscow. German soldiers could see the domes of the Kremlin through binoculars. Then the rain came. Then the mud. Then, in November, the German supply lines, already stretched to their absolute limit, began to fail. Soldiers who had crossed the border in summer uniforms were now standing in temperatures of -30 degrees. Their rifles jammed, their tank engines froze. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes by the thousands. The vast Russian winter, the same winter that had swallowed Napoleon's army 130 years earlier, began to do its work. Stalin had found himself again. He did not flee Moscow when the Germans came close. He stayed. He gave a speech on November the 7th, the anniversary of the revolution, standing in Red Square as snow fell, with German forces less than 100 kilometers away. His soldiers marched past him and straight to the front. The symbolism was not subtle. It was exactly what was needed. The Germans did not take Moscow. The Soviet counterattack in December pushed them back. Barbarossa had failed in its central objective. But the war in the East had only just begun. It would grind on for nearly 4 more years, consuming lives on a scale that is almost impossible to hold in your mind. More Soviet citizens would die in this single conflict than all the military deaths of all other nations in the entire war combined. While the Eastern Front bled, something happened on the other side of the world that changed the shape of the war entirely. December the 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. It is a Sunday morning. Sailors are eating breakfast. Some are still asleep. The air is warm and still, carrying the faint sweetness of the Pacific. Then the sound comes. Not from the ground this time, from the sky. 183 Japanese aircraft swept in from the north in the first wave. Then 170 more in under 2 hours. The Imperial Japanese Navy sank or damaged 18 American warships, destroyed nearly 200 aircraft, and killed 2,403 American servicemen. The battleship Arizona sank in less than 9 minutes. It took more than 1,000 men down with it. Franklin Roosevelt stood before Congress the next morning. His hands gripped the podium. He called December the 7th a date which will live in infamy. Congress declared war on Japan within hours. The United States had entered the war. Then Hitler did something that his own generals could not fully explain. 4 days after Pearl Harbor, without any treaty obligation requiring him to do so, he declared war on the United States. He actually declared war on the United States. He actually declared war on America, on the one nation with the industrial capacity to potentially outproduce the entire Axis combined. His reasoning was contemptuous and wrong. He believed America was weak, distracted, too far away to matter quickly enough. He had made the same mistake about Britain. He was making it again, at a scale that would prove fatal. The war was now genuinely global. Fighting raged across North Africa, across the Pacific, across the Atlantic shipping lanes, across the Eastern Front stretching thousands of kilometers. Armies and navies and air forces from dozens of nations were locked together in a conflict that touched every inhabited continent. But there was another operation running alongside all of it, one with no front line, one that appeared on no military map, one whose purpose was not conquest or territory or strategic advantage. Its purpose was murder. To understand what the Third Reich was doing in the occupied territories of Eastern Europe, you have to hold 2 things in your mind at once. First, the scale of the military war. Second, the fact that while all of that was happening, the Nazi regime was simultaneously organizing and executing the deliberate, systematic murder of an entire people. The Einsatzgruppen were mobile killing units that followed the Wehrmacht into the Soviet Union. They were not soldiers fighting an enemy. They were teams of men whose job was to round up Jewish communities, march them to the edge of pits or ravines and shoot them. At Babi Yar, a ravine outside Kiev, 33,771 Jews were shot over 2 days in September 1941. 2 days. The sound of the shooting was heard in the city. People in apartments nearby shut their windows and did not speak about what they heard. This was happening all across occupied Eastern Europe. In forests, in fields, at the edges of towns. By the end of 1941, the Einsatzgruppen had murdered over 500,000 people, and the men who organized these operations had already decided that shooting was not efficient enough. On January the 20th, 1942, 15 senior Nazi officials gathered at a villa on the shores of Lake Wannsee, just outside Berlin. The villa was elegant. The meeting was orderly. Minutes were taken. The agenda was the coordination of what the documents called the final solution to the Jewish question. The language was bureaucratic, precise, and deliberately indirect, but the meaning was unmistakable. The decision had already been made. What Wannsee formalized was the machinery, how the Jews of Europe, all 11 million of them as the documents recorded, would be identified, transported, and killed, which ministries would cooperate, which rail lines would be used, how the process would be administered across every occupied territory from France to Ukraine. Reinhard Heydrich chaired the meeting. Adolf Eichmann took the minutes. They finished in about 90 minutes. Then they had lunch. Think about that. 90 minutes to organize the murder of a continent's worth of human beings. Then lunch. The death camps followed. Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Helmno, and the largest and most systematic of all, Auschwitz-Birkenau in occupied Poland. These were not concentration camps in the earlier sense, places of forced labor and brutal conditions. These were purpose-built killing facilities. Railways ran directly to them. Trains arrived carrying men, women, and children from across occupied Europe, from France and the Netherlands, from Greece and Hungary, from Poland and the Soviet Union. They were told they were being resettled. Some believed it until the very end. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, newly arrived prisoners were sorted on the platform. Those judged capable of work were tattooed with a number and sent to the labor sections. Those judged incapable, the elderly, children, mothers with young children, anyone who could not work, were led directly to the gas chambers. They were told to undress for showers. The doors were sealed. The Zyklon B was dropped through vents in the ceiling. It took between 15 and 20 minutes. The bodies were burned in crematoria that ran day and night. The ash settled over the surrounding countryside. People in nearby towns could smell it. They knew what it was. More than 1 million people were murdered Auschwitz-Birkenau alone. Across all the death camps, across all the Einsatzgruppen operations, across all the ghettos where Jewish communities were starved and then liquidated, the Nazi regime murdered 6 million Jews. 6 million. 1/3 of every Jewish person alive on earth. They also murdered hundreds of thousands of Roma, tens of thousands of disabled people, Soviet POWs in numbers that reached into the millions, political prisoners, gay men, Jehovah's Witnesses. The categories of the condemned were broad, but the Jews were the center of it, the deliberate, total industrial annihilation of an entire people was the specific and stated goal. This was not a side effect of the war. It was not chaos or collateral damage. It was planned. It was organized. It was funded and administered by a modern state with functioning bureaucracies, railway timetables, and meticulous records. The same civilization that had produced Beethoven and Goethe and some of the finest universities in the world had built Auschwitz. That is not a paradox you can resolve. You just have to sit with it. While armies plashed across 3 continents and admirals moved fleets across 2 oceans, the Third Reich was conducting another operation entirely, one that had no military objective, one whose only purpose was murder. By the time it ended, 1/3 of the Jewish people on Earth would be dead. Look at Auschwitz-Birkenau from above. The railway lines running straight and purposeful to the platform. The ordered rows of barracks stretching into the distance, the crematoria at the far end, positioned with deliberate practicality. The scale of it, the deliberateness of it, the bureaucratic precision with which it was designed and built and operated. We cannot tell the story of this war without stopping here, without making sure you feel the full weight of what was at stake. Not just nations and territories and strategic objectives. Human beings, families, children who had names and had laughed at something that morning and would never laugh again. The war was not only being fought on the fronts where you can draw arrows on maps. It was being fought against people who had no weapons, who had done nothing, who had been designated for death by a government that had decided their existence was a problem to be solved. That is what Barbarossa unleashed. Not just the largest military invasion in history, not just the war that pulled America in through the shock of Pearl Harbor, it unleashed the full machinery of the Holocaust, moving at industrial speed across a burning continent, while the world's attention was fixed on the battles. The battles mattered. We will come back to them. There are turning points still ahead, moments where the tide begins, slowly and at enormous cost, to shift. But you needed to know this first. You needed to sit here with the smell of ash on the wind and the silence of Auschwitz, and understand what the men fighting this war were fighting against. Not just a military enemy. Something older and darker and more deliberate than that. Something that had looked at an entire people and decided they had no right to exist. That is what was at stake. That is what the next years of this war would be fought to end. The voice came through static, steady, controlled. A German officer reading a final situation report from the ruins of a department store in Stalingrad. His words clipped and professional, as if the building around him were not rubble and the men beside him were not dying. Then the transmission ended, and there was silence. 330,000 German soldiers had entered Stalingrad. 91,000, frostbitten and half-starved, walked out into Soviet captivity. Only 6,000 would ever see Germany again. This was the moment, though no one could quite say it yet, when the war began to turn. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, because before the turning, there was the falling. You have just sat with the silence over Auschwitz. You have just felt the weight of what this war was truly about. Now watch what it cost to begin to end it. Watch how many men had to die before the tide moved even 1 inch. The summer of 1942 was the darkest season the Allies had known. In North Africa, Rommel's Afrika Korps had driven the British 8th Army back across the desert like a retreating tide. The smell of burning petrol hung over the Egyptian sand. In Cairo, British headquarters staff burned their own documents in panic, feeding paper into fires while Mussolini flew to Libya to prepare for his triumphal entry into Cairo. He brought a white horse. He was that certain. The line the British chose to defend ran between the sea and the Qattara Depression. It was a narrow corridor of desert anchored at a place called El Alamein, which was nothing more than a railway station. But geography saved what men alone could not. The depression's steep slopes made Rommel's favorite tactic, the wide flanking sweep through open desert, impossible. For the first time, he had to come straight at them. He came, and he was stopped. Not cleanly, not easily. The First Battle of El Alamein through July of 1942 was brutal and grinding, full of confusion and costly mistakes. Australian soldiers at Tel El Isa took over 1,500 prisoners in a single morning assault, then held their ground against German tank attacks through days of punishing heat. New Zealand brigades seized ridgelines at night and found themselves exposed at dawn with no armor to protect them. The armor failed to move forward. Men surrendered in the open because there was nothing else to do. Captain Charles Eupen, already a Victoria Cross holder, destroyed a German tank with grenades despite a bullet through his elbow. Then he was captured. That was the texture of this fight. Heroism that was not enough. Courage that bled into the sand. But Rommel stopped. His 3 German divisions were down to 1,200 men each. His supply lines stretched back across the desert, and the RAF was tearing them apart from the air. He had driven too far, too fast, on too little. The line held. Barely. But it held, while the desert war ground forward, 6,000 miles away in the Pacific. Something decisive was already happening. In June of 1942, American naval intelligence broke enough of the Japanese naval code to know that a massive Japanese strike force was heading for Midway Atoll. Admiral Chester Nimitz had 3 carriers left. The Japanese had 4, plus a strike force that had humiliated every navy it had faced. On paper, this was not a contest, but Nimitz knew where they were coming. That changed everything. On the 4th of June, American dive bombers found the Japanese carriers in a moment that lasted less than 5 minutes and altered the entire Pacific War. 4 Japanese carriers, the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Hiryu, were caught with their flight decks loaded with fueled aircraft and armed bombs. The smell of aviation fuel was everywhere. Then the bombs hit. 4 carriers burned and sank. Hundreds of Japan's most experienced naval aviators died with them. Japan lost the offensive initiative in the Pacific in a single morning and never recovered it. The battle cost America 1 carrier, the Yorktown. It cost Japan something that could not be replaced, the sense that they were unstoppable. Back in North Africa, the summer gave way to autumn, and the desert changed commanders. Bernard Montgomery arrived to take charge of the 8th Army on the 13th of August. He was precise, methodical, and deeply certain of himself in a way that irritated almost everyone around him and reassured every soldier under his command. He walked the lines. He talked to the men. He told them there would be no more retreating, not 1 step back. He meant it. The Second Battle of El Alamein opened on the night of the 23rd of October, 1942. Over 900 guns fired simultaneously. The sound rolled across the desert like thunder that would not stop. Montgomery had spent weeks rebuilding his army, stockpiling ammunition and tanks and fuel, waiting until the moment was exactly right. Rommel was in Germany receiving medical treatment when the barrage began. His stand-in commander died of a heart attack from the shock of it. The fighting lasted 12 days. It was not elegant. It was attrition. It was minefield clearance under fire. infantry advancing through corridors of explosions, armor grinding forward against anti-tank screens that turned tanks into burning steel boxes. The Australians fought through the northern coastal sector with a ferocity that pulled German reserves away from the center. Then Montgomery struck the center anyway. On the 4th of November, Rommel's line broke. The Afrika Korps, the force that had seemed invincible across 2 years of desert war, began to disintegrate. Rommel sent Hitler a message asking permission to retreat. Hitler ordered him to hold. Rommel looked at the map, at the gaps where his army used to be, and retreated anyway. He had no choice. Churchill, when he heard, told the British people, "This is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is perhaps the end of the beginning." He was choosing his words carefully, because there was still Stalingrad. Hitler had ordered the capture of Stalingrad with an obsession that went beyond strategy. The city bore Stalin's name. That was enough. In August of 1942, the German Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus drove into the city and began the most savage urban battle in the history of warfare. Every building became a fortress. Every floor of every building became a separate battlefield. Soldiers fought for individual rooms, for stairwells, for piles of rubble that had been walls. The city smelled of smoke and rot, and something that the men who survived it never found words for. Soviet snipers moved through the ruins like ghosts. Soviet defenders held factories and grain silos by the Volga River with a ferocity that confused and exhausted the Germans attacking them. The Sixth Army bled into Stalingrad street by street, block by block, and the city swallowed them. Then, on the 19th of November, the Soviet counterattack began. Operation Uranus sent massive armored columns smashing through the Romanian armies on the flanks of the German position. The Romanians broke. Within 4 days, the trap had closed. 330,000 German soldiers were surrounded. Hitler forbade retreat. He promoted Paulus to field marshal, noting that no German field marshal had ever surrendered. The implication being that Paulus should die before he did. Paulus sat in the ruins of a department store called Univermag, the last headquarters of the Sixth Army, with frostbite spreading through his hands and the temperature outside dropping to 30 below zero. He looked at the walls around him. He said nothing. On the 31st of January 1943, he surrendered. The last pockets of resistance collapsed 2 days later. The final radio transmission went out from those ruins in a steady voice, and then there was silence. 800,000 Axis casualties at Stalingrad. The Red Army, which Hitler had declared essentially destroyed in the first weeks of Barbarossa, had just annihilated the finest army Germany had ever put in the field. Soviet soldiers who had been retreating for 18 months now stood in the rubble of a city they had refused to give up, and they knew something had changed. You could feel it in the way they stood, shoulders back, eyes forward. While Stalingrad fell and Elamine crumbled, the Allies landed in North Africa. Operation Torch, in November of 1942, put American and British forces ashore in Morocco and Algeria. It was the first time American soldiers had fought the Germans on land. They were green, and they showed it. The early engagements were rough, and at Kasserine Pass the Germans handed the Americans a sharp lesson in what experienced armored warfare looked like. But the Americans learned fast. They always learned fast. The strategic logic was now working against the Axis in North Africa. Rommel was retreating westward from Montgomery. American and British forces were pressing eastward from the Torch landings. The squeeze was on. The Afrika Korps, The force that had driven toward Cairo with a white horse waiting in Libya was running out of desert. The winter of 1942 into 1943 marked something that no single battle could have marked alone. It was not a moment. It was an accumulation. Midway in June, El Alamein in October and November, Torch in November, Stalingrad through the winter. 4 separate theaters, 4 different turning points, and together they amounted to something undeniable. The Axis had stopped moving forward. Think about what that meant. Think about the people in the camps. The machinery of the Holocaust running day and night. The crematoria at the far end of Auschwitz. Every week the war continued. That machinery kept running. Every battle that turned the tide was not just a military victory. It was the only force in the world capable of shutting those gates. These victories were not abstract. They were the difference between more years of industrial murder and the day when someone finally broke the locks. The cost had been staggering. It would keep being staggering. The road back from the Axis high watermark was not a road any army would choose to walk. German Field Marshal Paulus sat in Soviet captivity, hollow-eyed, stripped of his baton. The surrender documents signed. Half a world away, a Japanese admiral reviewed intelligence reports showing American carrier strength growing faster than anyone in Tokyo had predicted. He set the papers down. He did not speak. The Axis had reached its high watermark. But reaching the turning point is not the same as winning. The road back was going to be the bloodiest road in history. And it ran straight through the beaches of Normandy. 5,000 ships, 13,000 aircraft, 156,000 men. On the other side of the channel, the Atlantic Wall waited, and on the beaches below, which the Germans had mined, wired, and studded with obstacles, young men were about to run into the sea and try to take Europe back. It is just past midnight on June the 5th into June the 6th, 1944, somewhere over the English Channel. A C-47 transport plane carries paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division. The red light is on. The men check their equipment in silence. A sergeant looks out the small window at the black water far below. The smell inside that aircraft is sweat and engine oil and the particular metallic taste of fear that coats the back of your throat and will not leave. Nobody is talking. There is nothing left to say. The planning is done. The deception is done. For months, an elaborate campaign called Operation Bodyguard had fed false intelligence to the Germans, convincing them the real blow would fall at Pas de Calais. Entire fake armies had been invented. Fake radio traffic, fake equipment parks visible from German reconnaissance aircraft. The Germans believed it. They kept their strongest reserves waiting in the wrong place. And now the real thing is here, in the dark, above Normandy. The paratroopers jump into the black. The ground comes up fast. What happened on June the 6th, 1944 is one of the most documented days in human history. But documentation does not capture what it felt like to be a 20-year-old crossing a beach with no cover while machine gun fire cut across the sand at ankle height. It does not capture the weight of wet wool and soaked boots and a rifle you are trying to keep dry. It does not capture the sound, which survivors described not as individual explosions but as a single continuous roar, so loud it stopped being sound and became something physical, something that pressed against your chest from the inside. 156,000 men crossed on that first day. The largest seaborne invasion in history. 5 beaches. Utah, Omaha, gold. Juneau, sword. Some went better than others. At Utah, American forces moved off the beach with manageable casualties. At Omaha, the first waves of American soldiers walked into a nightmare. The German defenses there were stronger than expected. The naval bombardment had missed. Men drowned before they reached the sand. Men who made the sand were cut down crossing it. For hours, Omaha was a question with no good answer. But the men kept coming. They found gullies and they climbed. They went up the bluffs, one man at a time. By nightfall, they held the beach. Barely, but they held it. The cost had been enormous. The beachhead was real, but the road inland was not going to be easier. Normandy in the summer of 1944 is hedgerow country. The French call it the bocage, ancient earthen banks topped with dense roots and brush, walls that had been growing for centuries, so thick a tank could not push through them without exposing its soft underbelly. The Germans had turned every field boundary into a defensive position, every road into a kill zone. Allied forces spent weeks grinding through this landscape, paying for every few hundred yards in blood. It was not the sweeping liberation that anyone had imagined. It was close, ugly, exhausting work. The smell was corded and churned earth, and something else that veterans never described in polite company. The breakout came at St. Lo in late July, when American forces under General Omar Bradley launched Operation Cobra, punching through the German line to the west. It worked. German divisions began to collapse, and then something remarkable happened. The Allied advance moved so fast that a series of planned airborne operations had to be cancelled one after another because ground forces were overrunning the intended drop zones before the paratroopers could even board their planes. The Germans were running, not fast enough. Near Falaise, a large portion of the German force in Normandy got trapped in a closing pocket. The squeeze was brutal. What came out the other side was not an army. It was a remnant. And then Paris. The city had endured 4 years of occupation, 4 years of curfews from 9 at night to 5 in the morning, the streets going dark and silent as I held breath. 4 years of rationing so severe that finding coal for winter heat had become a full-time occupation. 4 years of German soldiers at the Ritz, German signs on the boulevards, German time on every clock in France. 13,000 Jews, including 4,115 children, had been rounded up by French police in July of 1942 and sent to Auschwitz. The machinery the previous chapter described had been running here too, in this beautiful city, in the middle of civilization. When the resistance rose on August the 19th, they did it with almost nothing. 20,000 fighters, 60 handguns, a few machine guns, no heavy weapons, against 20,000 German soldiers with tanks and artillery. But they seized the police prefecture on the Ile de la Cité. They threw up barricades in the eastern neighborhoods, tearing up paving stones with their hands. They took the city hall. The FFI commander, Colonel Henri Roll-Tanguy, directed the uprising from a bunker 26 meters underground, beneath the statue of the Lion de Belfort. The Allies had planned to bypass Paris entirely to avoid street fighting and the enormous logistical burden of feeding millions of hungry civilians. Then word of the uprising arrived. Eisenhower and Bradley changed the plan. General Leclerc's French 2nd Armored Division moved out on August the 23rd, 16,000 men and 200 tanks, driving for the capital. A small advance column reached the Hotel de Ville by 9 in the evening of the 24th. The bells of Notre Dame began to ring. Then every church in Paris began to ring. The sound rolled across the darkened city like something that had been waiting 4 years to be released. On August the 25th, the main force entered the city. There was still fierce fighting near Les Invalides and the École Militaire. French soldiers died within sight of the Eiffel Tower. But by midday, the Germans were overcome, and a tricolour flag went up on the tower that had flown a swastika for 4 years. General von Choltitz, the German commander, had been ordered by Hitler to leave Paris a heap of burning ruins. He signed the surrender instead, in the billiards room of the Montparnasse station. The city he had been ordered to destroy was still standing. De Gaulle arrived hours later. He walked down the Champs-Élysées the next day on foot, towering over the crowd around him. 2,000 Parisians had died in the liberation of their own city. He did not speak of that. He spoke of eternal France. The crowd needed to hear it. He knew what they needed. But the war was not over. In September, Field Marshal Montgomery pushed for a bold stroke. His plan was to use the 1st Allied Airborne Army, a newly formed command under Lieutenant General Louis Breton, to drop 3 divisions deep into the Netherlands, seize a series of bridges over the great rivers, and open a corridor 62 miles long into Germany. The ground forces of 30 Corps would drive up that corridor and relieve the airborne troops in sequence. If it worked, Allied forces would cross the Rhine, outflank the Siegfried Line, and possibly end the war by Christmas. The operation was called Market Garden. Market was the airborne assault. Garden was the ground advance. The 101st Airborne took their objectives near Eindhoven. The 82nd Airborne fought hard at Nijmegen on the Wide Waal River and did not secure that bridge until September the 20th. 30 Corps was already running behind schedule, delayed by a destroyed bridge at Zoon. When they finally crossed the wall in force, it was the 21st. And to the north, at Arnhem, the British 1st Airborne Division had landed too far from the bridge on drop zones chosen partly because the terrain closer to the objective was considered too soft for gliders. A single battalion under Lieutenant Colonel John Frost reached the Arnhem Bridge and held its northern end against everything the Germans threw at them. The rest of the division was pinned down and cut apart. 30 Corps never got through. The ground they had to cover was a single elevated road through flat Dutch terrain, and German anti-tank guns could see it for miles. The relief force could not move fast enough. On September the 25th, the survivors of 1st Airborne were evacuated back across the river. Of the 10,000 men who had landed, fewer than 2,400 came back. The operation had liberated Eindhoven and Nijmegen. It had not crossed the Rhine. The war would not end by Christmas. It would get worse before it got better. On December the 16th, 1944, 3 German armies attacked through the Ardennes forest in a massive offensive Hitler had ordered and his generals had doubted. The attack hit the American sector and hit it hard. German armor punched through the Allied line and drove west, creating a huge bulge in the front. Several American units were surrounded. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division was encircled in a small Belgian town with roads running out in every direction. Roads the Germans needed to keep their offensive moving. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's men dug in. They had no winter equipment. The cold was extraordinary. The kind of cold that makes your rifle bolt stick and your feet stop feeling like feet. German commanders sent a formal demand for surrender. McAuliffe's written reply was one word: nuts. The 101st held Bastogne. German strategic reserves, The last ones bled out in the snow of the Ardennes. By January of 1945, the bulge had been eliminated. The German army in the west would never mount another offensive. The Rhine crossing came in March, and Operation Varsity, the largest single-drop airborne operation of the entire war, put 2 divisions across the river on March the 24th in a single simultaneous lift, learning from every mistake Market Garden had made. By the 27th, 14 Allied divisions stood on the eastern bank. The road into Germany was open. But while Europe moved toward its end, the Pacific was entering its most terrible phase. The island-hopping campaign had been grinding forward since Guadalcanal, where American Marines had fought for 6 months in jungle heat so thick it felt like breathing wet cloth, against Japanese defenders who held every position until they were physically destroyed. The doctrine that emerged from that campaign and the ones that followed was brutal in its simplicity. There was no way around the defenders. You went through them, island by island, atoll by atoll, paying full price every time. At Iwo Jima in February and March of 1945, 26,000 Americans became casualties, taking an island 8 square miles in size. The Japanese garrison of 21,000 men fought from an underground network of tunnels and bunkers that naval bombardment could not reach. The Marines went in on the surface. The Japanese were below them, firing up through concealed openings, then disappearing back into the rock. The smell of sulfur from the volcanic soil mixed with smoke and blood in a combination that men who survived it said they could still smell decades later. Nearly all of the Japanese garrison died. They had been ordered to fight to the last, and they did. Okinawa was worse. 82 days of combat beginning in April of 1945. 12,000 Americans killed. Over 100,000 Japanese soldiers dead, and the civilian cost was catastrophic. Okinawan civilians, caught between 2 armies, died by the tens of thousands. Some were killed in the fighting. Some were told by Japanese soldiers that American troops would torture and murder them, and took their own lives rather than be captured. The truth of what happened to civilians who did surrender was that most were treated humanely. But the lie had done its work before the truth could reach them. On Okinawa, in June of 1945, a photograph was taken. An American Marine sits in the rubble of a shattered town, helmet off, head in his hands. Destruction runs in every direction as far as the frame can hold. He is not dramatic. He is not heroic. He is simply a young man who has been somewhere no young man should have to go. And he is sitting in the wreckage of it, and he cannot lift his head. The war in Europe was nearly over. But in the Pacific, the arithmetic was becoming unbearable. Military planners estimated that an invasion of the Japanese home islands could cost 1 million Allied casualties, and 1 million Japanese deaths on top of that. In Washington, a small group of scientists and generals were working on a different kind of answer, an answer that would end the war in 4 days and haunt the world for the next 80 years. This was the city that had launched the torchlit parades of 1933. This was the city where Hitler had promised a 1,000-year Reich. 12 years later, it lay in ruins, divided by 2 great armies closing from east and west, and somewhere beneath it, in a concrete bunker 50 feet underground, the man who had started all of it was watching his maps and refusing to believe what every map was telling him. Berlin, in April of 1945, smelled like burning stone and old dust. Entire city blocks had been reduced to chest-high rubble. Women picked through the wreckage looking for anything that could still be used. Children ran errands through streets where the buildings on both sides had collapsed inward toward each other. The city had been bombed so many times that people had stopped flinching at the sound of aircraft. Flinching required energy they no longer had. From the west, American and British forces had crossed the Rhine in March. The crossing at Remagen had been a moment of almost desperate luck. A railway bridge, scheduled for demolition, was captured intact before German engineers could blow it. Soldiers poured across before anyone on either side fully grasped what was happening. Eisenhower pushed his armies eastward. From the east, the Red Army was already moving in a wave that stretched across hundreds of miles of front. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's forces had crossed the Oder River and were driving hard toward the capital. Two colossal forces, one broken city between them. On April 25th, American and Soviet soldiers met at the Elbe River near the town of Torgau. They shook hands. They embraced. Some of them wept. A photograph captured two young men, one in American uniform and one in Soviet, grinning at each other on a shattered bridge. They did not share a language. They did not need one. The war in Europe had a seam running through it, and they were standing on it, but Berlin was still burning, and it would burn for days more. Inside the Führer bunker, Hitler moved armies on maps that no longer existed. He issued orders to divisions that had been destroyed weeks earlier. His generals stood in silence while he spoke, and the silence said everything. His hands shook. His left arm trembled constantly. He had aged 20 years in 12 months. Eva Braun, the woman he would marry in the last hours of his life, sat nearby. She had chosen to stay when she could have left. That choice tells you something about the world he had built around himself, a world where loyalty meant walking into the fire with him. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler shot himself in the Führer bunker. He was 56 years old. Eva Braun died beside him. Poison. Their bodies were carried up to the Reich Chancellery garden and burned per his instructions. He had started the war that killed 50 to 80 million people. He ended it in a concrete room, 50 feet underground, with Soviet artillery shaking the ceiling above him. On May 8th, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. They called it Victory in Europe Day, VE Day. In London, crowds filled the streets. In New York, strangers kissed strangers. In Moscow, people wept in public with a grief so deep it looked like joy. But in the places where the liberation was happening on the ground, in the forests and the fields of Germany and Poland, the soldiers who were doing the liberating were not celebrating. They were walking into something that had no name yet. The camps had been known about. Reports had filtered out for years. Jewish organizations had sent warnings. Escaped prisoners had given testimony, and the world had, in some essential way, not allowed itself to fully believe it. Then the soldiers walked through the gates, and belief was no longer a choice. Buchenwald was liberated by American forces on April 11th. General Dwight Eisenhower visited within days. He walked through and said almost nothing. Then he ordered every available soldier and journalist to come and see. He wanted witnesses. He understood, with a clarity that showed in every decision he made that week, that the world would someday say this had not happened. He was determined to make denial impossible. Edward R. Murrow, the American broadcaster, stood inside Buchenwald and described what he saw in a radio broadcast that made people across America stop whatever they were doing. Some of them turned the radio off. They could not bear it. Bergen-Belsen was found by British troops on April 15th. 60,000 prisoners were still alive inside. 13,000 unburied bodies lay in the open. The soldiers who entered wore no expression at all, because there was no expression adequate to what they were seeing. A British soldier named Robert Daniel later said that the smell hit them before the gates came into view. He said it was a smell that could not be described to anyone who had not been there, and that trying to describe it felt like a betrayal of what it meant. Dachau fell on April 29th. The American soldiers who entered found rail cars full of bodies that had never been unloaded. Some of the liberating troops, young men from Kansas and Georgia and Pennsylvania, simply sat down on the ground outside the gates and could not move. Auschwitz had been liberated months earlier, in January, by Soviet troops. The Germans had evacuated most of the prisoners on death marches westward. The Soviets found 7,000 survivors too sick to walk. They found warehouses containing the belongings of the murdered, hundreds of thousands of pairs of shoes, eyeglasses, children's clothing, human hair that had been shaved and stored for industrial use. The scale of it was not a metaphor. It was not a symbol. It was an accounting, a physical record of what had been done, person by person, until the number reached 6 million. The war in Europe was over. The war in the Pacific was not. In Washington, a decision was being made. It had been building for years in laboratories in Los Alamos, New Mexico, in the desert where scientists worked behind fences and did not tell their families what they were building. The Manhattan Project had cost $2 billion. It had employed 130,000 people. Most of them did not know what the finished thing would be. On July 16, 1945, in the New Mexico desert, the first atomic bomb was detonated in a test called Trinity. The flash was visible for 200 miles. The physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer watched the fireball rise, and a line from Hindu scripture moved through his mind. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." He did not say it dramatically. He said it quietly to himself, in the way a man speaks when a truth arrives that is too large to argue with. President Harry Truman had inherited the decision when Roosevelt died in April. He had known about the project for less than 3 months before the Trinity test. He faced the same arithmetic that had been haunting the Pacific campaign: an invasion of Japan's home islands, 1 million Allied casualties. Possibly more. Japanese forces had demonstrated on island after island that they would fight to the last breath. The projected cost of ending the war conventionally was not abstract. It was a number. And the bomb was a different number. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber called the Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, released a single atomic bomb over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The bomb detonated at 1,900 feet above the city. The temperature at the center of the blast reached several thousand degrees. 70,000 people died in the first seconds. By the end of the year, the death toll would reach 140,000. The city, a living city of streets and shops and families eating breakfast, was simply erased in a radius of devastation that spread outward from a single point. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. 40,000 people died immediately. The final toll there would reach 80,000. The pilot of that mission, Major Charles Sweeney, later said that he had done what he was ordered to do, and that he believed it was right, and that he thought about it every day for the rest of his life. All 3 things were true at once. That is the unbearable part. Japan's Emperor Hirohito addressed his nation on August 15th in a radio broadcast. Most Japanese citizens had never heard his voice before. He spoke in a formal, archaic Japanese that many of his own people struggled to understand. But the meaning was clear. Japan would surrender. The war would end. He described the atomic bomb as a new and most cruel bomb. He was not wrong. On September 2nd, 1945, aboard the American battleship USS Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay, Japanese officials signed the instruments of surrender. General Douglas MacArthur presided. Representatives of the Allied nations stood on the deck in the early morning sun. The ceremony took 23 minutes. When the last signature was placed on the document, MacArthur looked up and said, "These proceedings are closed, and the Second World War was over. 6 years. Every inhabited continent touched by its violence. Europe reduced to rubble from the Atlantic coast to the eastern steppe. Asia scorched from the Chinese interior to the Pacific Islands. North Africa churned by tank battles. The Atlantic and Pacific Oceans turned into killing grounds. 50 to 80 million people dead. The exact number is still debated by historians because the scale of the dying exceeded the capacity of any record-keeping to fully capture it. The survivors went home, or tried to. Many found that home no longer existed. Cities were rubble. Families were gone. The Europe they had left was a different continent from the one they returned to. Refugees moved in columns across roads that had been bombed so many times the original surface was unrecognizable. Children who had been separated from their parents in 1939 were now teenagers who barely remembered what their parents looked like. Whole communities, Jewish communities above all, had been annihilated so completely that there was no one left to go home to. And yet, in the middle of all of it, something was being built. The war was over. 50 to 80 million people were dead. An entire generation had been consumed. The world's cities had been reduced to rubble, and now humanity possessed a weapon that could end all of it. Not just a war, but civilization itself, in a single morning. The question was no longer how to win the next war. The question was how to make sure there was never another one, and for that, a different kind of building would have to begin. San Francisco, June 26, 1945. The War Memorial Opera House is filled with the sound of shuffling paper and the scratch of pens. 850 delegates, representatives of 50 nations, are signing a document they are calling a charter. Less than 2 months after Hitler's suicide in a Berlin bunker. Less than 2 months before the bomb fell on Hiroshima, in the brief interval between the end of one catastrophe and the beginning of the next kind of terror. 50 nations gathered in San Francisco and signed their names to something they called a charter. It was not enough. They knew it was not enough, but they signed it anyway because the alternative, doing nothing, building nothing, learning nothing, was a choice they could not live with. Lord Halifax, the head of the British delegation, stood before the final plenary session on June 25th and said something that stopped the room. The question we are about to solve with our vote is the most important thing that can happen in our lives. He did not ask for a show of hands. He asked those in favor to stand. Every delegation rose. Then the crowd rose, and they stayed standing in a hall that smelled of cigarette smoke and floor wax, and something harder to name. The particular exhaustion of people who have carried grief for 6 years and are not yet sure they can put it down. The numbers alone are almost impossible to hold in your mind. 70 to 85 million dead. Not soldiers alone. Civilians burned in their homes, starved in occupied cities, murdered in camps built for the single purpose of murder. Entire peoples erased. The Jewish communities of Europe, ancient and irreplaceable, annihilated so completely that the silence where they had been was its own kind of wound. Across Europe and Asia, millions more wandered without homes, without families, without countries. Children who had been separated from their parents in 1939 were now teenagers who barely remembered what their parents looked like. The physical destruction was staggering, but the human destruction went deeper than any rubble. And yet, before the war was even fully over, something was already being built in its ruins. The trials began in Nuremberg in the autumn of 1945. The surviving leadership of the Nazi regime, men who had ordered the murder of millions, sat in a courtroom and faced something new, not revenge, law. The prosecutors argued for the first time in history that certain crimes were so monstrous that they existed outside the jurisdiction of any single nation. Crimes against humanity. The phrase was new. The concept was new. The world had never before put a government on trial for what it had done to its own people. The defendants shifted in their seats under the courtroom lights. Some looked at the floor. Some looked at nothing at all. The tribunal convicted and sentenced, and in doing so, it laid the first stones of an architecture that would eventually become international criminal law. Imperfect, contested, but real. The same months that produced Nuremberg also produced the fractures that would define the next half-century. At Yalta, in February of 1945, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin had sat together and redrawn the map of the world. At Potsdam that summer, with Roosevelt dead and Harry Truman newly in his place, the cracks widened. The Soviet Union wanted buffer states in Eastern Europe. The Western powers wanted free elections. Neither would fully get what they wanted, and neither would fully give way. The alliance that had defeated Hitler was already, in the summer of victory, beginning to come apart. The cold wind of what would become the Cold War moved through every conference room, every negotiation, every handshake that did not quite mean what it appeared to mean. And still, on October 24, 1945, the United Nations came into existence. The Charter had been ratified by the 5 permanent members of the new Security Council: the United States, the United Kingdom, France, the Soviet Union, and China, and by a majority of the other signatory nations. 51 countries in total that first year. The General Assembly would give every member state an equal voice. The Security Council would hold primary responsibility for international peace. The International Court of Justice, seated in The Hague, would adjudicate disputes between nations. The whole structure rested on a single, hard-won conviction that the conference table had to be made more powerful than the battlefield. Eleanor Roosevelt sat on the committee that drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the General Assembly in 1948. She had seen enough of the world, enough of its capacity for cruelty, to carry no illusions about what a document could and could not do. But she sat at that table anyway. She argued, she pushed, she insisted that the rights being named, civil rights, political rights, economic rights, were not the property of any one civilization but the common inheritance of every human being alive. The Declaration was not a treaty. It was not legally binding, but it became the foundation on which 2 binding covenanters would later be built, and it named something that had been left unnamed for too long: the worth of a person. Any person. regardless of race, sex, language, or religion. The world the war made did not stop at the Charter. The Marshall Plan began rebuilding Western Europe. The State of Israel was established in 1948, a direct consequence of the Holocaust and the displaced persons crisis, and immediately became the center of a conflict that would outlast the century. Across the colonized world, the war had shaken the foundations of empire in ways that could not be repaired. Nations that had been promised freedom in exchange for their soldiers' lives began demanding it and getting it. In 1960 alone, 17 new states joined the United Nations, 16 of them from Africa. The organization that had begun with 51 members would eventually grow to 193. The decolonization the Charter had implicitly promised was slowly, unevenly, incompletely happening. And the nuclear age did not wait. The bomb that fell on Hiroshima fell 6 weeks after the Charter was signed. The first resolution of the First General Assembly meeting called for the elimination of atomic weapons. It was not eliminated. The arms race began instead. The Cold War paralyzed the Security Council for decades, as the United States and Soviet Union used their veto powers to block each other at every turn. The organization that had been built to prevent war found itself unable to stop the wars in Korea, in Vietnam, in countless other places where the superpowers chose to fight by proxy. The UN failed in Rwanda. It failed in Bosnia. It has been criticized for corruption, for inefficiency, for bias, for irrelevance. All of that is true, and all of it was, in some sense, already known by the people who signed the Charter in San Francisco. They were not naive. They had just lived through the worst thing human beings had ever done to each other. They signed it anyway. There is a photograph from November 11th, 1918. Jubilant crowds in Paris. People weeping and embracing, telling themselves it was over, and then they went home and built the world that made the next war possible. The men and women who survived the Second War knew that story. They had lived inside it. And so they built something different, imperfect, fragile, contested, and incomplete, but still standing. The question they left for us, the only question that has ever really mattered, is whether we have the will to keep it that way.